Please allow me to reintroduce this fun guy with a quote on the book. So the book that we are talking about today is incredible. It's Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance. And Rick Doblin, PhD and founder and president of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelics, has said, this book is the most comprehensive and data-based book on microdosing ever written. Over time, this book will be recognized as a classic in the field. That's huge. So we are beyond excited and grateful to have with us microdosing expert, researcher, Juris Doctor with a master's in art, Renaissance writer, and co-author of the book we're diving into today, written with his bestie and godfather of microdosing, Dr. James Fadiman. Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance, the man, the legend, Jordan Gruber. Welcome to the MindfulMEDS Community Connection Call.
Hey, Shannon, it's a real privilege to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we're delighted. So we'll just have a quick agenda. We'll go through the main aspects of the book, and that's microdosing for health, microdosing for healing, and microdosing for enhanced performance. And we'd really like to bring it back to foundational perspective. We can get, microdosing, as you've said in the book, is about 15 years kind of old. It's a baby still.
Modern microdosing.
What's that?
Modern microdosing, yeah, is about 15 years old.
Modern microdosing, of course. And we really just don't want to talk about it from a psychonaut perspective. We want to bring it back to the foundations and not complicating it from a beginner's or newbie kind of navigating this journey. So we'll get questions from the community at the end, and we'll also share with people how you can win one of 2 stacks of Lion's Mane, Social Spark, Happy Days, and Modern. And then some lucky person is going to win a copy of the book. But first, Jordan, we want to get to know you a little bit. Can you share, how did you get into psychedelics and this work particularly, and maybe a fun, weird fact about your psychedelic experiences?
Sure. I got into psychedelics back in college. Tim Leary was not far around where I was back in 1977 and 78. And I had been working for Ralph Nader, a very progressive liberal, and doing good things in the world. And I had an epiphany that politics as usual was hopeless. There was no chance that it would solve anything, and that the only way to save the bioplatform, the living planet, human, the Earth, was through human potential. And so psychedelics and human potential have been things I've been looking at all along. I'd always, even in junior high school, been interested in parapsychology and psi and telepathy and psychokinesis. And in college, it was philosophy. And by the time I was 21, I had become a pagan with the local pagans and worshiping the goddess, and had some experiences when I was 22, including being on mushrooms in a sky-clad ceremony on the full moon and literally feeling the goddess actually coming out of the woods and emerging and being in and through all of us. I was completely connected with her. And in that period, I also did meet Leary, and I had another mentor, a guy named William Carl Eichmann, who was sort of a cross between Gurdjieff and Aleister Crowley, and he mentored me quite a bit. And so I stayed with psychedelics ever since, through all the other things I did, the New Age seminars and the men's work and everything that I did. Psychedelics was always a big part of it. But then in 2011, I helped Jim Fadiman a little bit with his book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, or that was 2010, and especially about microdosing. And then Jim and I wrote another book together from 2015 to 2020 called Your Symphony of Selves, which is about healthy multiplicity. And when that book was done, we realized that Jim had literally written the book on microdosing psychedelics. So now it was time to actually have to make that into a book, as he had been collecting thousands of reports from all around the world and every study that he could find. And then it took us 4.5 years to find the right agent who gave us the brilliant idea of making the book question and answer, like the book What to Expect When You're Expecting. And just, it was, a very interesting and difficult project. There was so much information coming in up until the very last moment. If we get to do a second edition, I've already got plenty of things that need to be in there, and so many different reports coming in and so many studies, and collaborating with Jim really hand in hand. So that's how we got to here today.
Amazing. Thank you. And there's so much to chew on in that, but like just kind of getting to meat and potatoes here. What's yours and Jim's definition of microdosing, and how does it differ from macrodosing? A lot of people are still kind of confused about what's the difference.
Sure. So Microdosing is very low doses. It's not a high dose. When you take a high dose of any kind, you get high. When you're microdosing, you don't get high at all. You might be a little bit aware that you are on a substance. Jim originally came up with the word subperceptual, which stuck, but it's not really subperceptual. Psychedelics are notoriously difficult to blind, and that includes all the way down to the microdosing level. So you're aware on something, but there's no major changes in consciousness. There's no visual anythings. Unless you already see stuff like that, you might see a little more, but there's no, the wallpaper doesn't smile at you and there aren't anacondas eating you. There's no noticeable visual distortions. You don't have any qualms about having your ordinary day. For me, the difference between microdosing and mini dosing, this is no longer the case. We had a cat who was dying of diabetes. I had to give him insulin shots. If I was more than microdosing, I wasn't comfortable with needles. So I could really feel the difference when I was a little bit too intense. And also when you're microdosing, nobody is going to know that you're on something. Usually people forget about it. And then to quote Ayelet Waldman, by the end of the day, they've had a really good day. Maybe they're a little bit nicer. Maybe they've worked out a little bit harder. Maybe they've been a little bit more productive. But generally speaking, unless you were going to have it anyway, there's no major revelations. There's no major insights around God and goddess and your personality structure. You're just, having a very small change to what's going on with you. But we also know that microdosing is not just placebo. And we know this in several different ways that I could go into if you want. But because we know it's not placebo, we know that there are some things that are always going on when you're microdosing. One of them is that you have an enhanced neuroplasticity profile. Neuroplasticity refers to neurons and populations of neurons rewiring, as they say, and connecting and unconnecting in different ways. So we know there's more neuroplasticity when you're microdosing. We also know that especially the classic psychedelics, but maybe Amanita as well, have a pretty strong anti-inflammatory effect. So when people are microdosing, they just feel better. And we also know, and this is kind of a funny word definitionally, that microdosing brings you back to homeostasis, or let's say to a sense of equilibrium, or let's say into a self that you're more comfortable with and you feel a little bit better with. So those three things, and there may be more. We're thinking that that they may be reinforcing mitochondrial efficiency and health also, but we don't have enough to say that. So these things are always actually going on when you're microdosing. Now, really importantly, a microdose is not something, for the most part, that anybody does every day. All of the protocols have time off built in, although there's some exceptions that we could talk about. So the most well-known protocol is Jim Fadiman's, which is day one you're on, day two you're off, day three you're off, day four you're on. And you go through 6 to 8 weeks, and then you take a couple of weeks off. By doing this, not only is there wasn't really a problem with tolerance anyway, but now there's no question that there's not a tolerance problem, and it gives you the time to all of the new learning that's happening and all the ways you're feeling and what you're learning to do if you're doing it for performance. You have plenty of time to experience it and to take it in and to really lock it in. If you take 100 micrograms of LSD once a month versus taking 10 micrograms 10 times a month, I believe you're going to learn a lot more through the 10 microdoses because it's much slower and it's not stressing you at all. And macro doses, anything above what we're calling for most people 5 to 12 micrograms of LSD, they are going to have effects on your blood pressure and your heart rate and which self you're in, and you'll start to feel things and you'll get unfocused, and all those things do happen. And microdoses don't do any of that. So, it's this really slow, really subtle, but very real way of enhancing yourself and healing.
Beautiful. Thank you. And there's, sorry, Keeks, like you just flow with me, whatever I've got questions for days. I could talk to Jordan forever, but interrupt me if you like.
Well, I want to go back to the neuroplasticity. Can you let us know what is exactly happening in the brain? Talk, if you can, Jordan, tell us a little bit about the default mode network. What's the default mode network? Like what it is so people can understand and what.
Okay, that's two different questions though. Let's start with neuroplasticity and then go to the default mode network. So I had a lot of fun writing the main piece on neuroplasticity because there wasn't a piece out there that was at the level I needed to read to understand something the way my brain works. So what we did was we went through all of the ways that taking large doses of psychedelics are known to change the brain. And that includes physical changes to the parts of the neurons, the dendrites and the axons. It actually changes their shape, and it also makes them fire differently, so they're connecting more. Now, just as a footnote, neurons are way more complicated than we really understand. They actually communicate, I've learned, in 7 different ways, one of which is like radio frequencies. So we mainly focus on one way that neurons work, which is these charges through the synapses, from the dendrites to the axons to the dendrites. And that's just one of the ways. So we know there are physical functional changes in your brain when you are taking psychedelics. We also know that something called BDNF, which is it a hormone or is it a whatever it is, there are markers of it. And we have seen that in both macrodosing and microdosing, you have more BDNF going on. And some of these different measures, as outlined in the book, we know there are changes that go for up to 30 days. So we know there are physical changes in how the brain works structurally and how it works functionally. And we know this both from mainly rodents and sometimes monkeys and some human. You can't go in and slice up people's brains, but they do with obviously with rodents. So one of the things that we've learned is that there are similar signatures, but at a lower amplitude between macrodosing and microdosing for all of these different markers. And for a new marker that Connor Murray has come up with called neural complexity, or somebody else came up with it, but he's applied it. We know that your brain is actually very different, even when you're microdosing. And here's a fun fact. 1 microgram of LSD has 1.54 quadrillion, that's 16 zeros, molecules of LSD. So if you're taking a standard microdose of 10, let's say, which is a little on the high end for LSD, that's 15 quadrillion molecules of LSD, and your body has 30 or 40 trillion cells. So there's plenty of LSD to go around. So even when people sometimes mess up and take 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less than they're supposed to be taking, they're still having really good results. But yet it's real. It's not, for example, and I'm not supposed to say this so directly, but it's not like homeopathy, which when you get to the higher doses has statistically less than 1 molecule of the actual substance that you started with. We're talking quadrillions and quadrillions, and with mushrooms, it's even more, although I don't know the numbers precisely with those. So neuroplasticity refers to neurons and populations of neurons and the way they connect and the way they fire and the way they reach out. We know that on psychedelics that the brain really changes. There's one type of neuron, and Andrew Huberman, the science podcaster, talks about these optical frontal lobe neurons that like sprout like a mushroom out of them when you're on a high dose. And Andrew's all, well, I'm not saying you have mushrooms in your brain, but they look like that. So, and that completely changes the way they're communicating. So we know that when there's more neuroplasticity, you can both create new connections of things that you want to lock in, like behaviors or performance, shooting free throws, and you can also pair things. You can also relax connections. If you think about Eckhart Tolle's pain body, you can let go of some of that and some of your way to go right into that. So neuroplasticity is usually, but not always, a good thing. Andrew Huberman, again, talks about with high doses, because he's a microdosing skeptic, but at high doses, his analogy is there's like a big boulder. And with your psychedelics, you leverage up this boulder and it starts rolling through the village of your mind. So this is the neuroplasticity, and you want to know where to direct it. You want to till fields and maybe take down a building that's old, but you don't want to go through the school classroom. So you've got neuroplasticity. With microdosing, you're using much smaller levers, but more regularly. And the boulder isn't a boulder; it's more like a rock. And so you have a lot more control over where it's going. So that's kind of what neuroplasticity is generally.
So can I pause you there just for a moment?
Please.
In maybe 2 sentences, how would you explain to somebody that's never heard the word neuroplasticity?
Yeah, neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to be plastic, to change the way it hooks up different ways of thinking and different nervous reactions and communication. It actually it gets more plastic, and you can mold the way you think, the way you act, the way you heal, the way you experience yourselves and other people differently in neuroplasticity. So it's kind of like it's a little bit softer, it's a little bit different. It's not stuck in the same exact mold, which brings us to your second question.
Yes.
That was good enough. So
yes, thank you.
You hear a lot about the default mode network. We talked about the default mode network here also. When you're in the default mode network, this is the part of you where you're just hanging out, maybe not even ruminating much, doing stuff. This is the part of you that you're in most of the time. And we've known that high doses of psychedelics tone down the default mode network. And in fact, very high doses tone it down in similar parts so much that you can, lose your human identity 100%. We have a great essay that Jim wrote about his transcendent dose of LSD in 1964 and what it was like to completely lose connection here. And we have, Dennis McKenna taking way too many mushrooms and throwing off his glasses and all his clothes and running into the forest and taking 2 weeks to re-identify. So, if you have too much going on, and so an allied thought is about entropy. And Robert Carhart Harris and others are putting this out, is that you have entropy is how much disorder there is in a system. Some people believe that eventually the universe will be in a heat death there'll be no energy differences between any 2 points, and that'll be the end of everything. There won't be any entropy left. But entropy is disorder, entropy is chaos, and the brain is built basically to tone down entropy. I mean, think about the brain to begin with is built to take a booming, buzzing confusion and take maybe 1/2 of 1% of the input that's coming into you at any moment, so you know what to focus on and what you can deal with. If I was to look at all the items and all the things I have here, I would be completely frozen. That started happening as I did that. So you don't want to necessarily go that high, but when you're microdosing, what's happening is there's more entropy in the brain. So the default mode is gone and there's more entropy, there's more action, there's more ability to connect and reconnect things in a different way. It becomes a bit more wild and woolly. But what we're saying is at the microdosing level, we know this is happening, but there's a lot of people who are never in their life going to want to take a large dose of psychedelics. We may not be those people, but they may very well be the majority, even though 40 million Americans have tried LSD since it was made illegal. So, and 8 million took psilocybin mushrooms last year since it was made illegal, and finally made illegal in 1970, but effectively in like 67. So, there's a lot going on here, and you want more entropy. And whether it's the default mode network, and Jim and I in this book, I'll stop promoting it, talk about shifting into a different self, a different part of who you are. I very much think that's part of what's going on. So for example, we have people who are in pain who say, you know what, I still have the pain, but I'm no longer the pain. And that's what's going on all the time. And that's who I am. I'm somebody who has some pain now and I deal with it. So it's a shift of inner perspective. So, we haven't really talked about the benefits, but I really now see 3 classes of benefits to microdosing psychedelics, notwithstanding the title. One is physical and mental health conditions. We have an A to Z list of, I don't know, what is it, 35 things in the book and another 5 in another chapter, and more are going to come in. Another is enhanced performance. That's art, creativity, but also sports, physical stuff, sex, nearly everything. So that's the second, is anything you like doing, because think about it, we're back to neuroplasticity. You're in a different self. I'm like in the self now that can throw ringers with horseshoes. Hey, look, I believe that I can do that and I can do that. I've had that happen on vacation. I've also had the opposite happen where I can't like land a ringer, right? So it's like, which self are you in? But when you're neuroplastic, you have more of an ability to kind of decide to be which part of you that you want to be. So, yeah.
So let's say if you have, so my understanding of the default mode network, and correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially the place where if you have anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorders, all the big things, you spend a lot of time in that portion of the brain. And so like the big things going on in our society, do I have that piece right?
Well, so here's the thing. You do have it right, but it's right, whatever you normally are in. So if you're in a self that is dominated by anxiety and doom scrolling, and you've stopped exercising, and you're letting yourself eat all the bad things the other parts of you really shouldn't be eating as much of. If you're in that part and you're stuck in that part, that will be the default mode network. So you need to find a way to not be in the part of you that is stuck. It literally helps you get unstuck, which in Michael Pollan's interview with Oprah that came out a couple of weeks ago, he uses that metaphor of getting unstuck.
Yeah.
Now, you can get unstuck in a big way at a high dose with a therapist or a coach and, have intentions and go in and spend a day recovering and do weeks of integration. And that is absolutely the right thing to do for many people.
Yeah.
But you can also do it with microdosing over 3 or 6 months and get I believe, just as much value. There is something to be said for the fireworks of big doses. I mean, who doesn't like it when it's going well? But it also has, some trepidation at the beginning, and it's not always easy coming down all the way. And the next day, sometimes we don't sleep as well. So if you don't need to have that, why not start with what we know is working really well, and that's microdosing.
So can microdosing help you get out of the default mode network and create new neuroplasticity, new connections in the brain so that you can get out of these loops?
Yeah, that's exactly what it's doing.
That's exactly what it's doing. And what is exactly happening? Is it the blood flow to that portion of the brain gets shortcutted, or what is the psilocybin doing to the brain to help you break out of these behavioral patterns? And then all of a sudden you're becoming this new version of you after time.
I don't really think that I know, and maybe we don't know why exactly. There's a lot of study of what the brain does under psychedelics. Sometimes it's this new 2024 Connor Murray study we're talking about spectral power, and that for these higher doses, it goes down in theta and delta, which is not what I would have expected. I would have thought there would have been more of that. So, the actual physical mechanism, I don't know. I mean, we can talk about the serotonin receptors, but that's an oversimplification. It's more than just this one serotonin receptor we always focus on. That's kind of the best scientific handle they have, but there's obviously more going on. And if we're talking mushrooms in particular, I mean, LSD is one molecule. It either is or it isn't LSD. Mushrooms is a whole entourage of other chemicals going on. And so that works in a different and more complex ways. And it might deal with dopamine and it might deal with gabapentin. And so, that I couldn't really describe to you the physical level of what's going on and why it happens. But we know now that it happens. I mean, there's a lot of studies of flashing lights and which parts light up. But at the end of the day, what you know is these parts light up and these parts don't. I don't think generally they know why.
Okay.
And we might not for a long time.
No, thank you for that. It's Jan, how did you want to follow that one up?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the book you reference about 80% of the depressed group in a study reported that they were less depressed overall, and many of them significantly so. Like not just, I think I feel better, but like, no, I feel like me again. I feel like a different person. And a lot of people on this call, a lot of people in Canada and America are on antidepressants or on benzodiazepines to try to get themselves back. So if 80% of people are making marked improvements, what do you attribute that to in microdosing? And
well, it's all these things we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's the neuroplasticity, the toned down default mode network, the enhanced entropy gives you the chance to, look at, sorry, I didn't finish the third set of benefits and it's relevant. So the physical, mental, and health benefits, the performance benefits, and you're better able to experience your own selves, your own parts or subpersonalities, and you're better able to see it in other people. So when someone's doing something that you don't like in your family, you go, that's just part of them. You don't totalize so much. So when you put all of these together, I mean, the anti-inflammatory effect could be enough because people feel better. When you're feeling better, it's easier to heal, it's easier to be nicer, it's easier to perform. When you return to equilibrium, which again is this idea of getting into a better self for what you're about to do next, everything goes better. And you have the neuroplasticity happening all at the same time. So, when we first put out some of this stuff, we heard from Professor David Nutt, who's one of the most revered psychedelic professors in Britain. And he at the time said, now I've read this list of 15 different things that microdosing helps for. But I got to tell you, as soon as I hear that something's helpful for 15 different things, I go, yeah, I'm suspicious. So Jim spent a bunch of time thinking about that. And he ended up saying, well, is there anything else that's good for almost everything? And Well, there's exercise. Exercise is good for almost everything. Eating well is good for almost everything. Getting enough sleep is good for almost everything. So,
Yeah.
in a way, microdosing, with or without a therapist or a coach, with or without setting intentions and doing integration, it's kind of like a magic vitamin pill. You don't really have to know anything about why it works or how it works, or even really put any intention on it. But if you believe that putting intention on it will make a difference, then for you, it will make much more of a difference. So when you see a study like that where 80% of the people are better, our first thought is, medicine should always start at the lowest level that's likely to work and at the lowest risk. And then if that doesn't work, go up. But my intuitive gut, and this is controversial, and even the big thinkers in the psychedelic leadership, a lot of them haven't come close to embracing this yet. They're still kind of thinking in the old box. But I think
Yeah.
maybe half or more of depression, including treatment resistant depression, where none of the drugs have worked, would actually, with even just a little bit of help in terms of guidance, get rid of half or more of the depression we have out there in a way that's incredibly safe and far less expensive
Yeah.
and no risk at all, hardly, almost
Yeah.
zero risk. But that is so controversial that it's hard for people who have invested in the big dose with a therapist model to quite embrace it yet.
Let's talk
Well,
about that quickly. Let's talk about the safety profile. What did you guys uncover writing the book about just how safe this is? I know Professor David Nutt put that massive study out, the drug study, the one that was kind of two-pronged. It was the harm that had happened to you when you take it, and the harm that happened to the community around you. And the number one most harmful drug in the entire world, I bet we could all think of what that might be. Um, we all know it. It's alcohol.
I was gonna say
And at
alcohol, yeah,
number zero on his study, David Nutt's study,
right.
zero was mushrooms. So I think there's people here. My mom's here tonight. I think my mom, and somebody like her, she's gonna be 70 soon. Talk about the safety profile because this piece fascinates me personally.
So we start with the fact that psychedelics as a whole are incredibly safe. Until last year, actually, we had never had a confirmed case of somebody dying from a massive overdose of LSD. Now, there's kind of one on the record. It was in an Australian study, and maybe that happened. Maybe the guy had a predisposition to a heart thing anyway. But
Yeah,
generally speaking, even when people have taken massive doses, nothing physiological. They've always come back. People are always okay. Now, if you go down to the level of a standard recreational dose, say 100 micrograms of LSD or 3 grams of ordinary mushrooms, dried psilocybin-containing mushrooms, it can be intense and people might not sleep well. And in the early days, people talked about a few people, including Art Linkletter's daughter, famously ended up harming themselves. So, on the large doses, there is a very, very, very small chance that there could be some safety problem. But with microdosing, you're taking that risk and you're cutting it by 90%, or maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's logarithmic. I don't know. But you're cutting the risk to almost nothing. What we do hear from people, and the Mothers of the Mushroom survey, which Michaela De La Mico let us publish her results from in the book, 10 pages of, there were occasionally people who had some sleeplessness or who had some stomach stuff or who had anxiety about the fact that what they were doing was on some level illegal where they were. And,
Mhm.
mushrooms are, even at a microdose, some people are going to react to mushrooms. And, you can always do lemon teching, so that's not going to happen. And you can get past that. But generally speaking, taking it too late in the day and maybe not being able to sleep as well is about the only thing that's ever happened to anybody. Now there is a fear. Well, there's two unsubstantiated fears. One is that microdosing thickens heart valves because there is a pharmacological model based on giving rats way too much of something, and they got sick, that maybe this would happen to human beings too. So far, we have no actual cases of this ever having happened. The pharmacologists will get in your face, and they did when Jim and I presented last year at a conference. They were like standing up and saying mean things. Fortunately, their mic wasn't working at the time, so we didn't hear most of it. But they want it to be true because they want there to be something wrong with it.
Right.
The second is that, well, there are certain people who should never try a microdose because it's just too dangerous. This includes pregnant and breastfeeding mothers. But
Okay.
if you read Mama de la Maico's survey results, the women are overwhelmingly positive. Nearly everybody recommended
Yeah.
it. The kids are healthier and smarter. They're having better latching mechanics and parenting, and no longer, the postpartum depression. It's so much better for them. So, and indigenous peoples throughout the world have been using as part of birthing and after birthing, giving small microdoses since time immemorial, since as far back as we know about or have records, although it's mostly, a verbal kind of thing at this point. So that doesn't happen. And then you get to, well, fine, but what about people who are bipolar? What about people who are schizophrenic or have any of that in their family? So the answer is very similar to the heart valve in a way. Right now, we don't have any actual cases of somebody microdosing, not taking, twice as much mushrooms and wrapping it in chocolate. That's not microdosing, you know.
Yeah.
But we don't actually have any cases of somebody having a full-blown schizophrenic fit. I mean, modern day cannabis with its 30% plus THC, that's a real problem. And there are cases of schizophrenia and withdrawal syndrome. And, you got to watch it and not get that kind of cannabis if you possibly can. But microdosing, we haven't actually seen these cases. So you'll find an almost reflex reaction by anybody who has any legal or monetary stake, where they'll always say, but consult your family doctor, consult your this, consult your that, because if you have even had the little bit of schizophrenia and you take a microdose, you might go completely crazy. So we've never seen anyone actually having that happen to. And the irony here, is that what if this actually would work to heal people? So bipolar is a particularly good answer. So when we first started looking at bipolar, people had asked him about it. He said, well, I think you better stay away from it. But then he went ahead and looked on Reddit. And if you go on Reddit, there's many people who have talked about their bipolar. And by and large, they've all come to the agreement that if you're in your down phase, you're fine to microdose. If you're in your, it used to be called manic depressive. If you're in your manic phase, don't microdose. Come on, think about it. But they're getting a lot of value from it. So once again, there's a lot of legal CYA that goes on where people automatically and reflexively say, these people can't try this. This can't work. And you sort of see that creeping into this idea that for serious mental problems, it has to be high doses with a therapist. That's the only thing that can work. It's not safe. It's like, what if less is enough? What if less is more? What if you don't need? And so let me just mention a new study came out on ADHD. You've probably all seen it. All the headlines, New Scientist, double blind, they're all saying microdosing doesn't work for ADHD. But guess what? They tested at 20 micrograms. 20 micrograms is almost double the high end of a microdose. That's not microdosing. That's mini dosing. And one of the great things we have from Connor Murray is we have evidence of certain sorts of mental benefits happening at 13, but not at 26 micrograms. So the New Scientist headline and all the rest, they didn't test microdosing. They tested mini dosing. And I would tell you that mini dosing won't work for almost anything, including performance. So, I like to mini dose sometimes and go to the gym, but then I have to rest for a few days extra and I get distracted. It's not as good. Less is actually more. And that goes so much against the generally ingrained Western capitalist and way of doing things. More is always
American
more.
way.
Our friend Avi Esther coined this phrase, the mores. You're like a 4-year-old. More. 20 micrograms isn't a microdose. So you've proved that mini dosing doesn't work. Thank you.
Awesome.
Jen,
And
last thing for me, I just want to wrap it up on the safety profile, because I cannot tell you how many questions we get about pharmaceutical interactions.
Right.
I'm on this, is it safe? I don't know. And in 2019, when we began this company, we didn't have the answers. In the back of your book, you guys probably have a list of about a couple hundred pharmaceuticals that that you guys have researched or had some research or at least some data, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that list was originally created by Jim Fadiman and his partner at the time, Sophia Korb, who has a PhD in data science and such. And so they were basing this on the reports that they got in. Now, that list is also now available on the Microdosing Institute of the Netherlands website. Jim helped found them originally, and we have a close relationship with the director, and they're keeping up that list. So one of the things that, had to be done before this came out was I had to compare the list we had with their list. And there's a couple of things that went from this is cool to this is not cool. So this brings us to the bigger question of tapering. We call out 5 conditions in chapter 4 that are worth noting. And one of them is tapering off of pharmaceuticals. So there seems to be this thought growing that you should taper off completely before you start microdosing. So the first thing to know is that if you're going to taper or taper off, that you should do it with the advice and blessing of whoever prescribed the medication for you in the first place. There are known tapering schedules. It'll take longer than you want, but you should stick to that schedule. It might be 2 or 3 months before you taper off of something, because I think that is not on a straight curve.
Absolutely.
At the same time, what we found and the reports we're hearing is that microdosing makes it easier to taper. It makes it not faster, and you're not replacing one with the other. Big mistake, don't do that. But it's, again, we're talking about less inflammation, so people are feeling better. We're talking about more neuroplasticity and tuned down default mode network. So you can get into the part of you that likes being your body and likes playing the piano or giving or getting massages or whatever it is that actually brings you pleasure. You can move into those parts of who you are. And so that's just going to lift kind of the whole boat of healing and being alive.
Yeah. Let's pause just for a moment. Let's check in with everybody. I know we got the chat going live. Welcome, everybody. So grateful to see all these names. Let us know where you're from. Let us know if you're comfortable, how old you are, because I'm really interested to see the segments of growth throughout these years. So many different segments of ages that are now microdosing. And let us know, did you microdose today? Have you microdosed before? Have you never microdosed? I'd be really interested in all of that. Shan, I think we should talk about ADHD.
Yeah, I would love to get into the topics in the book, like the healing and health and the enhanced performance. And you touched on it earlier, Jordan, about the ADHD and ADD. And you in the book, there's a quote like, "We have clear evidence that people with ADHD have been able to improve some of the skills they needed in school over and above what they achieved with medication alone." Can you speak to that a little bit? And maybe you did kind of cover what's going on in the brain, but some of the reports that you've been given are just phenomenal. Can you speak a little bit to the ADHD and other neurological issues?
Well, that's one of the reasons we called that out separately in chapter 4, because Jim's had a lot of reports about that. To the degree that there have been a case of a set of parents who had twins who were, I think they were twins in school, and they had been on ADHD medicines. They'd been on Ritalin. And when they got to school, to college, their psychiatrist said, they're doing great. They don't need it anymore. And the parents threatened them and said, oh, if you take them off the Ritalin, we will make trouble for you legally. So people are very addicted to the kind of focus that Ritalin gives, and other drugs, but they're addictive and you can't get off of them. And some people are on Ritalin for life. And the US government says Ritalin is fine for kids as young as 3 years old. So there's like 50 to 80,000 3-year-olds in the United States. So why Ritalin works, why something that's sort of a stimulant works to calm you down is not exactly known. And again, I think I'm going to disappoint you in not being able to give you more of a neurological basis for why it works. So, we don't have any theories. Jim loves to say, we don't have any theories. We just have real world evidence and we're presenting what people have told us. We have some basic ideas about what's going on. But so I don't really know why ADHD is improved. But it seems that people, are once, if your normal self is hyper distracted and you have normal patterns of going from, doom scrolling to, eating to just not doing anything, and that's your normal pattern, and you have more neuroplasticity and more of an ability with the tuned down default mode network to move into a different part of you that can focus, then you're able to just kind of move into that self and be more accomplished. And we also noticed that for people who stopped microdosing, those who really focused on their school skills while they were microdosing, they pretty much retained a lot of their enhanced study and school performance even after they stopped microdosing. And other people preferred to come back to it because they noticed that they were actually a little bit better off at it, which brings us to, in a big picture question, is the goal of microdosing to get off of microdosing forever? And my answer to that is, for some mental conditions and emotional conditions, certainly. For some people, that's going to be the goal. for some physical and healing things, like this guy who's taking the pain every day, he may be taking
We got to
microdoses
talk about that. We
for,
definitely have to talk
for
about
the
that.
rest of his life, and maybe that'll be just fine. Or for the, the cluster busters people, cluster headaches, you know, if they feel a headache coming on, they're going to microdose or up to, we could talk about that too and how that developed. That's an interesting story. So I'm not sure that everybody's going to, for physical conditions, going to want to have a goal of being off of it. And then for enhanced performance, I mean, assuming you're taking time off, and I struggle with that sometimes. I don't really want to take a week or two off, but I try to make myself doing it. But if you're playing better basketball or better music or having better sex or writing better or doing whatever you love better, sure, you want to take the time off and like get to ground zero and reset. But the goal that you should want to eliminate it all is sort of similar to that old notion of why a lot of the classics in the 60s, a lot of the gurus said, once you get the message, you hang up the phone. That might have been Ram Dass himself. But, if the message is that you can have less inflammation and more neuroplasticity that you can use positively, and that you get back to homeostasis better, and that you can put yourself in the right frame of mind or the right subpersonality more easier. I feel that this idea of you should want to get off is more about sort of like an anti-pleasure and an it's kind of like a religious statement about anything that you're doing to anything that you're taking in that is really good for you must be bad for you on some level, and you should have this goal of getting rid of it at some point. And I just don't buy it. I think that's just part of the stigma against psychedelics overall.
Yeah, it's a supplement. It's a spiritual supplement that it grows from crap and is readily available for a reason. It's been available for all of time.
Right? It may have co-evolved our minds, as the McKenna's pointed out, right? The stone ape hypothesis. So who knows?
Brilliant.
So can I ask you a question that's a bit personal? So I struggled with alcohol for about 9 years, ended up in rehab in 2016, and it's really what led me to this project. One of the things that was, I think, really important to me was learning that mushrooms are non-addictive. And you wrote in the book that they're actually anti-addictive.
Yeah,
you speak to that? Because I think that's going to blow people's socks off to learn.
Right. So with psychedelics, if you take more, then you need more to get to the same place. But then if you do that again a couple of times, eventually you're not going to get high at all. It's just not going to work. It sort of stops you. It has a built-in break. So you can't really get addicted to psychedelics physically.
Yeah, I saw James Fadiman on a podcast. He said it like this, I believe. Like he said, if you took 1/8 of mushrooms, so 3.5 grams on a Friday,
right,
you're going to transcend, and maybe you touch God and you see some things and you go somewhere. But if you do it on a Saturday, it's just the music and the colors start to kind of dance, but it's kind of like a watered down version of the Friday.
Right.
And if you do it again on a Sunday, nothing happens.
Pretty much.
Nothing happens. And so, man, that is so important for people to understand.
Which goes really well with this idea of the 3-day protocol. I like Jim's protocol a lot more than I like Paul Stamets' protocol. I think 4 days on and 3 days off, although there are some reasons why that might work for some people in some circumstances, is just too much. So with Jim's protocol, it's the second day that people often like the best. So we talk about the second day effect in the book. On the second day, you're still kind of like seeing around corners just a little bit. You're still feeling the mojo, but you don't have any body load at all. And that's also the day we have good scientific proof that people sleep the most. I think it's 36 minutes more in the test study. They were using one of these devices, a Whoop, and it's like people sleep better. So there's a lot going on that second day with nothing going on. And that's because it's not, this pharmaceutical, mechanical model. Like when pharmaceutical SSRIs work with your brain, they're clogging up a system. It's like putting a wrench in the system to stop it from working, and that's how you get the effect. Microdosing doesn't work that way. It enhances and binds with the receptors in a way that's much more organic and that lasts longer in a different kind of way. And for me, all of the different, there's a lot of systems in the body. There's physical, there's emotional, there's organs. People believe we have energy bodies. There's a lot of things going on. if microdosing is affecting all of those and kind of opening up your whole picture for a while, then, you can spend a day or two kind of reweaving it. Think of if you've read Castaneda, Carlos Castaneda, and if you haven't, you should. He talks
Yeah.
about the luminous energy egg that is actually what we are, that shimmering and has all these different patches. You get to sort of experience your own luminous energy egg and kind of get to recraft it and bring it back the way you want it in a more harmonious and powerful way.
Got it.
Amazing.
All right, Shannon,
Guys,
you
I'd
take
love
it
to
home.
just ask. Yeah, I'd love to bring it back and actually check in with people on the call. Like, drop an emoji if you are a woman listening to this right now. We have about 80% of our community is female, and I'd love to touch back to Mama Delamaiko. That's her handle on Instagram. Give her a follow. She's just so tapped into this stuff, and what you cover in the book with her, she's amazing. On pregnancy, on conceiving, on breastfeeding, and you talked about it. But I mean, one quote in the book was a woman saying with premenstrual syndrome and microdosing, she didn't have the urge for suicidal ideation, and she didn't have the urge to leave her family, and she had 100% recommendations on it. Can you touch back to some of the things that Michaela shared with you in kind of indigenous wisdom?
Yeah, well, what we talk about the power of story. So if you give yourself the chance to read those 10 pages of the
Yeah,
stories in a row and step back and go, oh my God, humans were, meant to be giving birth in this context. It works so
yeah,
much better. And we know for women's issues generally, for PMS, for PMDD, post-menstrual dysphoric disorder, which is like
yeah,
PMS on steroids, for postpartum depression, we're finding that people are having a lot of healing, and that those who previously parented without the help find this time a lot easier and a lot better. And so overall, they're finding the connections with the people in their life, from their newborn to their other children to their partners, go a lot better. They're finding the physical mechanics of dealing with a newborn and breastfeeding are going a
yeah.
lot better. They're finding that they are feeling better about themselves right away. And so it just seems like a natural fit. That's the kind of thing we've been prevented from studying. And interestingly, when we looked out at it, you would have thought that this would have been studied by somebody somewhere. There's no research whatsoever, because we're in another one of those loops about you can't take anything while you're pregnant because it's going to harm the
Yeah.
baby. So nobody's kind of put it together. But now that we're looking, we're going, ah, now you can say, well, it's a self-selected, group of women. It's just anecdotes, but you read those stories and you can't tell me that there's not something going on. And for PMDD, for example, there's almost nothing that works out there in the world. So it works for PMDD, and microdosing works for PMDD, and that makes a huge difference to people. So, the book is not a recommendation or prescription or prescription that anybody should do anything in particular, but we put out like a sumptuous buffet of possibilities. And this is the kind of thing that you might be interested in if this is what you're up against. Because again, the reward to risk ratio is very high. There's very, very, very little risk. Not to say that, you could get into a legal problem, you could, have anxiety, you could not sleep so well, you could have some stomach stuff. But compared to the positive benefits that you might experience, it seems like a pretty good risk to take.
Absolutely. And some of the things in the book, like if I've heard the term, happy wife, happy life. This isn't just for women. It's people that know and love women. But if you can have just an alleviation of some small issues, life is better. You can just travel through the day and everything becomes more tolerable and more manageable. And I'd love to ask too about enhanced performance. And you referenced Ben Greenfield, but I don't know if you've heard of this guy. His name's Dante Liberato, and Buffalo Warrior. He is on Instagram, but he's running like 500 miles. Let's put that into Canadian, 804 kilometers, microdosing LSD and psilocybin in 7 days. Like that's astounding. And can you share some of why you think that is possible and why athletes are gaining this competitive edge with microdosing?
So what we heard from Ben Greenfield when we did our interview with him is that in the long distance running community, the word is out that microdosing makes a big difference. People are
Yeah.
shattering their records. People are, we know that microdosing reduces pain. So part of when you're running like that, there's a pain equation at a certain point. We
Yeah.
know from studies in cold water that microdosing reduces pain. Um, we know that people have more energy. We know that they're better able to get into the right frame of mind. And Ben said that, at the competitive edge of running, the word is out and everybody, I don't know who he has an elite group of friends and contacts, but among
Yeah.
that elite group, it. So my thought is, and has always been that nearly every physical performance you can think of, tennis, basketball, hockey, wrestling, the word is already out in MMA. And Foreman was
Yeah.
talking about it. It's people are understanding now. That's not to say like Doc Ellis famously took a major dose of LSD. There's a great Squiggle Vision video where he can like barely see anything, and yet somehow he managed to pitch a no hitter. That's not what we're talking about here. Generally speaking, if you take too high of a mini dose, you're not going to perform well at all. You're going to get distracted. You're going to have a big burst of energy early, and then you're going to get tired. So that's not it. But the thing about microdosing is it's in this sweet spot where you have more energy and more resilience and less susceptibility to pain and more ability to be in the right frame of mind without overamping your system. So that's what we think is going on. We know about it in running. We have reports from a few other sports. I think volleyball, I'm sure we'll find out it's true in. I used to be pretty good in foosball, in tabletop soccer. I'm sure it's true in that. I'm sure it's true in table tennis or ping pong, which I was also good in, and I may pick that up again. I'll find out. I'll experiment. I'll go on days when I am and days when I'm not. I think your reflexes are going to be better. We
Mm.
know that people get into athletic states of flow, of course, as Csikszentmihalyi talked about, where time slows down. The basketball hoop seems like this thing that's 10 feet wide. I don't think. Uh, I think that you are more easily able to get into flow, athletic, and peak states when you're microdosing. I think that you know how to move into the part of you that's really good at doing something, whether it's writing or playing music or making love or volleyball or martial arts or like whatever you like doing. So, how many things are there that people like doing? Hundreds of them, right? Crocheting, skiing, right? Jumping off of cliffs with parachutes, right? I mean, or what's that thing with the jumpsuits where they go against? They look like they're
Windsurfing.
flying bats, and that is so scary. When you look at the first person point of view on that stuff, you will see people microdosing in every single one of these because you are literally getting more access to your potential performance profile. More of you is available. You're feeling better. You're less inflammation, less pain, more energy, all that. Why wouldn't you want that for the things you like doing most? Maybe it's just reading, reading while microdosing. I haven't seen anybody talking about that, but I've certainly done quite a bit of it. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. And one of the things you touched on sports, and someone that you mentioned in the book is NHL former Stanley Cup winner, Dan Carcillo, and he's in this community. And he had traumatic brain injury and
Right.
just was suicidal, and really there was no way out for him. He was ready to end it, from multiple concussions. And we're talking to a Canadian American audience. There's people here that their kids are in hockey and they're in hockey and sustaining these horrible injuries.
Yeah.
He healed his traumatic brain injury and concussions using psilocybin and a combination of high and low doses. But can you share maybe something a little bit about that, but also maybe some of the most astounding things you've seen with healing? We've had so many reports of this.
Well, so that's the thing. When Jim started this whole process, nobody knew anything about anything, right? We had very few reports. He started asking people for reports, and he was surprised from the beginning that some of the reports were about physical only conditions. This included things like, well, nothing's really only physical, right? It's always spiritual and emotional and mental, but
Right.
things that are thought mainly. So shingles, for example, people have, had a lot of success with shingles. Headaches, people have had a lot of success with both migraines and with cluster headaches.
Yeah.
And TBI, traumatic brain injury, is something that we keep hearing from. So I don't think we know, again, I always hate saying that, exactly why the brain seems to respond and be able to heal itself. If we think about the brain as having a lot of capacity, these studies where people lose one sense and then, let's say they become blind, but then the parts of their brain associated with hearing are much bigger all of a sudden. I'm assuming our brains have a huge amount of capacity. With microdosing, and certainly with higher doses, you have access to more of that capacity. We're back to neuroplasticity. You have the ability to make new connections that serve you and to make things, to rejigger it so that you'll be able to do what you've been doing. So if something was damaged, I mean, each time they check each other in hockey, my sister took, when I was in high school, took me to, we had second row seats. It was the Islanders against Philadelphia. And when one player checked another from you, as far as my screen is from where I'm sitting right now, you felt that. It's like being in a car crash, right? Their bodies are going to be really beaten up. And I'm sure, even though we haven't heard any about this, or I've written about and known some jockeys, professional thoroughbred jockeys, those guys are hurt the worst of anybody because, each time they fall off, it's like being in a major car crash. And they go on and on. I have this gut feeling that microdosing would be really helpful for them. So these deeper levels of healing, or in something like long COVID, there are people who are getting responses on long COVID that nothing else is helping them. Or for oh shoot, what's that crazy bacteria, Lyme disease? We have a
Yeah.
lot of reports about Lyme disease, and Lyme disease is one of those things that I've known quite a few people who go years with nothing working, and then they'll find some practitioner who has just the right combination of hypnosis and stuff and what they're doing that they get better. But I think microdosing could work for a lot of people who have Lyme disease. So you see this whole range of physical things that we weren't even aware were going to be on the table of one of the things we were going to be looking at. And yet I think we talk about eczema in the book, do we? I'm not sure at this moment, but it's,
Yes.
there are different things and it seems to be working. So at this point, I go back to the reward risk profile. Depending what you've got going on, and pain is another one of them. That's one of the 5 we call out in chapter 4. Long-term chronic pain microdosing really seems to help. You might not get rid of all of your pain, but you're going to get rid of maybe some of it or a lot of it. Or again, you're going to shift into that subpersonality that doesn't identify primarily as I'm in terrible pain. I had tooth stuff for a year and a half, and most of the time I was in like that part of me. And now it's all better, and I'm so much happy that that's not a part of who I am. But when it was there, I could get stuck in it. So microdosing helps you move into the parts of you that aren't stuck, and know how to focus. And so you've got the ongoing neuroplasticity, you've got the ongoing anti-inflammatory effect. Maybe you've got ongoing better mitochondrial performance. Maybe and a generalized, it seems like a bit of a cheat term, return to homeostasis or equilibrium, because you really look into the definitions of that. It doesn't really mean anything in particular, other than people seem to return to the parts of them that feel good and experience pleasure. And if they're having, what's called anhedonia, nothing that they like is bringing them any pleasure anymore, it could be as simple as microdosing. And I recommend this for everybody, is to go back to your habit that you had 10 years ago or 15 years ago before you were so immersed in the digital everything, and listen to entire albums of music from your favorite performers, starting in the 60s, or classical if you like that. Just give yourself the pleasure of listening to Brahms' Third Symphony or listening to Abbey Road, start to finish. Yeah, you can do some other things, but don't have your mind anywhere else. Have your mind and emotions with the music like we used to do. And listen to a whole 45 minutes of a theme album like we used to do. And it's so affirming and pleasurable. And and so I'm working on that. I try to listen to some music that I love, or do some singing or noodle on the piano every day, because I love music, and it's just too easy to get into doom scrolling. Or like when I'm publicizing this book, I go from looking at what's happening on Instagram to Facebook to LinkedIn. And do I want to check in on TikTok? Is there anything I need to say anywhere? Is there anything new I need to promote? Do I need to do the website? It's like, enough. You gotta let go. You gotta get into the part of you that loves life and is at a slower pace despite all of the digital stuff. A former client of mine, Jim Rutt, who was the president of the Santa Fe Institute and a really brilliant guy, wrote a piece called Reclaiming Your Cognitive Sovereignty, how I went back to a flip phone, and you can too. Now, I'm not saying you should go back to a flip phone, and Jim actually kept his iPhone when he went to Europe. So, but the point is, breaking free from our slavery to the digital world.
Dopamine trap.
Excuse me.
It is a dopamine trap.
Totally.
Absolutely. And microdosing does help regulate dopamine also.
Amazing. I love that you said that. Amanita Dreamer, she talks about microdosing Amanita and just saying it in the way like the problem is still there, but it's no longer a problem anymore. You're able to zoom out and just see without this emotional connection to this thing that is pulling you down. You can just actually be out of the issue and be able to solve it from a different energy, which is how we know to be able to solve problems. So that's fascinating. And I love that you're playing the piano, that you're into music. Terence McKenna says that during psychedelics, that music is the shamanic wave carrier that helps us heal. Like, why do you think that it's so healing to have blindfolds on and to have, when you're doing these kind of bigger doses, or even if you're microdosing and you have some time to yourself, put on music that moves you?
Yeah, well, music and Terence and Dennis, you're probably aware of the experiment at La Chorrera.
Oh, you might need to refresh our audience.
Terence did a thing called True Hallucinations. It's a book, but better, it's a 10-hour audio program that's online for free, in which he describes how he and Dennis went to South America looking for ayahuasca, but instead ended up taking huge amounts of mushrooms. They were eating like a couple of pounds, right? And I don't know how much. They had huge amounts. And the experiment at La Chorrera was they were attempting to do a certain type of humming that would change the spin frequency and the electrons in their brain. And they were trying to do that to fully liberate consciousness. So they were working with toning to try to unleash an even higher crazy level of intensity. And that's what the experiment at La Chorrera was about. And the 10 hours of True Hallucinations, if you're ever on a long car trip, just listen to it, because it's produced, it's got a rock and roll band, but it's his actual recordings of them on the trip. So you hear the boat, you hear the monkeys, you hear people talking to each other. It's just a crazy vision. So there's something about sound. Some people think that the word is what created reality. Some people think it's light and sustains it. Some people think it's sound. So to the degree that we are, we're back to that luminous egg of Castaneda. What makes it coherent? What brings your symphony of cells together? It's frequency and its pattern. And music is just such a huge, big way of doing that. I mean, that's why I still love classical music so much, because without words, you're just, you feel into it. Your whole body responds. And that's not just happening with your brain, it's happening with your emotions, and it's happening with your physicality. I mean, we're literally moved by music if we're not too hung up, at least if we're alone, right? And so, I'm frequently on my mini trampoline, my high grade rebounder, when I'm listening to music, because I like to be moving while I'm listening. But just closing your eyes and being silent, and back to Terence's psychedelic missionary position, 5 grams in a closet with a blindfold on and just don't move for a few hours, you will have the most intense experience. And many of the best guides that I know are really into their music and really know what they're doing. But there's other people who don't want to be carried away by the music, because inside of you have your own internal music playing already, right? You are already connected with the harmony of the spheres. Once when I was in college and I came home and I got high and went down for a nap, and my dad was across the hall, I literally heard blaringly loud symphony music in my head, like in a dream state, that I'm pretty sure was the music of the spheres. And my dad was a real big classical fan. So, I think we're always hearing, and we're always vibrating, and sound is part of what holds us together organismically and emotionally and spiritually. So that's, why music. Now, for me in particular, I'm a 60s and 70s baby, and my brother and sister are older than me. So even though I was born in 1960, I heard all of the music as it was new and was real. And when I'm feeling most spiritual, I'm usually listening to the Moody Blues or David Bowie, or sometimes the Beatles and a few others, Leonard Cohen, of course. And that's where I go. Some of the Stones. So that, and I think that if you listen to certain music regularly and you know where it's going to take you, then it's easier to move into certain states with it. And that's why I like the classical. That's why I like, Brahms third and Beethoven seventh, and some of these symphonies that are just, genius works. And we're able to, hear them hundreds of years later and what they were experiencing, what was going on in history at that point.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm just mindful, we want to get to some of the questions from the lovely community here. But just before we do, and Keegan, you have another after this, but I just would love for you to mention why citizen science is so important. Like, this book exists. You said it's written by Dr. James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber and hundreds of others. Can you share why it's so important? Why, like, people on this call might contribute to your next book, just sharing their experiences?
Yeah, functionally, it's that microdosing resists the double-blind protocol. The double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled protocol, which we just call the RCT, came about in America and was legislated into existence after the thalidomide disaster worldwide. Thalidomide wasn't released in the US, but some of it made its way here. And I have a thalidomide baby friend, and it's a terrible drug that caused all kinds of deformed limbs. So they came up with this way that pharmaceuticals had to be tested against each other, where nobody knew anything about what it was, and that was it. But microdosing, and certainly mini and macro dosing, you almost always know when you're on the substance. So it doesn't work as a criterion. It's an unwinnable scenario, like if you're a Star Trek fan, the Kobayashi Maru scenario. You can't win it. You have to go outside of it. Now, there are some ways of microdosing within patients and later date and using an active placebo, but generally speaking, it doesn't work. And even when MAPS lost its PTSD bid for using MDMA for psilocybin, one of the things they did was they released their functional unblinding data, even though they weren't required to. And it showed that something like 85% of the people who were on knew they were on, and 75% who weren't on knew that they weren't on. So having that, so we quote Jeff Bezos at the start of chapter 6, what's it, 5? And he says, if your data and your anecdotes disagree, your anecdotes are usually right. And it's not so much that you didn't collect the data right, it's that you're asking the wrong questions and measuring the wrong things. So microdosing really works in the context of people's ordinary lives, not even in the context of laboratory experiments, although there are a couple of tests, like there's an LSD for depression in Canada, at-home study going on. And I think there's one in New Zealand for PMS or PMDD. And so some of the companies and health systems are starting to realize that at home LSD can work for some of these things really well. So we're gonna find out more about that and where it has to go. Oh, I lost my train of thought. I knew it would happen. I lost my train of thought.
You've been cruising. It's yeah, this has been absolutely fascinating. Shen, why don't we do this? Let's give away some products. I've got a little idea. So today would have been my dad's 71st birthday. Aww. And he dedicated his entire career to mental health. He had his master's in psychology, and he built social programs in the UK in the early 1990s that are still to this day in place. And to be honest with you, it's why I do the work that we're doing right now. So if anybody could guess the country that my father was born in, think about my first name. The first person to type the country right is going to win the first stack.
Oh, we've got people already.
Close. Oh. Did somebody say Ireland? All right. Who was the first Ireland?
Janine? Oh, no, Sarah.
It was Janine.
And you're the winner, baby. Congrats.
Yay, that's great.
So Janine's getting a stack. And then where should we go from here? Should we answer a question and then we'll give out another stack, and at the very end we'll give out the book?
Yeah, let's see how if people want to ask questions, or I'm not sure how they've been coming in. Haven't had my eye on the box, but um, yeah, let's just let people share what they want, and if there's no questions, we can move on from there. But Jordan, you're very fascinating.
Yes,
Some
this
of
has
your
been
You're
hobbies
very
are
incredible.
just
kind.
This has
incredible.
been so much fun.
You know,
Kat,
sometimes I feel great
dinner.
about myself and sometimes I don't, you know, it's like everybody else, I
Uh,
think.
well, and you've written another book. You shared the book that you've written with Dr. James Fadham, and also the Symphony of Selves. And I mean, that's fascinating. I got a little bit into that in the lead up to this, and it's just an eye-opening approach to who we are and how to zoom out and see the many selves. So
Mhm.
that's incredible.
Yeah, that's a fun book because it has cartoons.
And you've also got a book about rebounding.
Right. Yeah, bouncing on a
Bounce.
mini trampoline on a high, they're with bungee bands these days. I've been bouncing every day pretty much since 2002, sometimes more, sometimes less, but I have a coach. I used to sell rebounders and I gave workshops and stuff, but now it's just more of you know, I'm an apostle of rebounding because it's really fun. If you have any knee injuries or anything like that, it takes 75, 80% of the weight off your body. You can go aerobically really hard. It definitely builds muscle. I would say go to radicalrebounding.com. That's my favorite coach. It's a woman named Rachel. But honestly, I know 5 or 6 women coaches around the world, and every one of them is incredibly buff. So there's something about being on a rebounder and going through, I think of it as going through
My
a
goodness.
gravitational force flux where the amount of gravity your cells are experiencing goes up and down in a pattern. And you can bounce. I used to bounce for 45 minutes at a time, and it was just, you know, you can really get into it and it's fun, and you can do it with, you know, by yourself, and you can do it watching a video or listening. As long as you're on the rebounder or moving up and down, it's going to give you lymph movement, which is immune system benefits. It's going to give you aerobic benefits. It's going to give you balance benefits, and it's just a really fun, effective way of exercising that I'm still surprised there aren't literally 10 or 100 times as many people rebounding because it's just so fun and effective.
Got to get a rebounder. I think we've got a question here. Andrea Whitehall asks if I were to do, or sorry, I can't see your full last name there. If I were to do a 6-month protocol, how long would I break for in between? This is good because we can recover a bit of protocols because people don't know, you know, you said 6 to 8 weeks and then have a little bit of a break, but could you cover that again? And she's asking about a 6-month protocol.
Yeah, I think you just kind of break it down. Most people go 6 or 8 weeks and then take about 2 weeks off after that. So I think all you have to do is kind of multiply that out over the whole time period that you're doing. You know, the truth about microdosing is that it's a bit like learning to drive a bike or ride a car. At first, it's a little bit hard, and it's good to either read a manual or get somebody to show you how to do it. Once you learn to do it and figure it out, especially if you have a reliable source or you've created your own source, then it gets easier. And then eventually, people usually adopt what we're calling the intuitive protocol. For some people, it's
Mhm.
every other day. For some people, it's Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. You know, everybody kind of finds their own way. And there are a lot of people who microdose less over time, and sometimes
Yeah.
people find that they need less of a dose over time, which is another way of it being anti-addictive. I know that I don't actually need as much LSD as I used to need to be at the top of my spectrum before I get into mini dosing. I have to tone it down or I'll be mini dosing. And I think that's because your brain and
Mhm.
your body learn what it's going to be like. You're going to be in a slightly different gear, access to cells, more energy, less inflammation, and you know how to use it and you know how to make use of it. So over time, there are people who drop down. I haven't really ever heard of anybody needing more over time if they're taking time off in between and then if they're taking the breaks.
Awesome. Thank you. We do have a question. And Keegan, what do you
Yeah,
go
no,
for
this
it?
is actually this is a great question.
Yeah. Go.
This is coming from Sarah. She says, I've been microdosing on and off for a year, and I always get tired from them and have to have a nap. I do have some issues going on, including chronic pain, fatigue, OCD, PTSD. FYI, I use them early in the evening. I can't see the last little part for some reason. Um,
So
but,
I
talk,
could
but can you talk
transition.
about the fatigue? Because this comes up quite often, to be honest. I hear reports of people just feeling a bit tired. I have what I think an answer is, but I would love to hear from you, Jordan.
Well, Michela de la Mico's answer is that a lot of people just need more sleep,
Yeah.
especially new mothers. And so when you're microdosing, you've tuned into your body enough to realize that you really need more sleep. So a lot of people are just chronically sleep deprived.
Yeah.
So you might just need more sleep. And another thing you can try is cutting your dose in half. Pretty much if anything isn't working well for people, the first thing we say is try cutting your dose in half. Knowing that there are people out there who are taking much less than you're going to be taking, even when you cut it in half and still getting really good results. And maybe also you just need to take a little bit later in the evening. And some substances we know are going to bring about, like Amanita, is going to probably make you sleepy. And so you just have to kind of learn to judge it and guide yourself that way.
Yeah.
Awesome. And you did answer this before, but maybe just a little bit more clarity. So when people are on a protocol, specifically their first or second one, and they're still getting to find their sweet spot, how long do you reckon that they should have a break from the medicine? Like say 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off,
Yeah,
or
I mean,
gauge it themselves?
less is always more in microdosing. Well, not always, but almost always. So, and less is almost always enough. So, yeah, I mean, I would say the smart thing to do for a brand new beginner is do 6 weeks on and then take 2 weeks off. Some people like to take 3 weeks off, but I think that's possibly more than they need. And so 6 on and then 2 weeks off. And by the end of those 2 weeks, you'll be fully reset. And then when you begin microdosing again, you'll be grateful that you are, and you'll be more able to kind of tune into the benefits and really take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question just popped up. So how does microdosing mushrooms affect someone who has had psychosis before? And you did kind of touch on this with the schizophrenia and the bipolar, but are we talking about psychosis as a...
So
Yeah.
what we've said and what I said is we've never actually heard anybody having a psychotic episode brought about by taking a microdose. It's possible that it's like people die every year when they go to Burning Man. If you have enough people there, someone's going to die. If you have enough people who has psychosis and some of them are microdosing, some of them would have had another psychotic fit, episode triggered at some point just because of what's going through their lives. But the direct connection between one happening and the other, we haven't actually seen that. The recommendation is always to ask your doctor. I talked about the CYA thing, and I'm doing it now, but everybody says you should ask your doctor just in case. But honestly, your doctor is unlikely to know anything about this. You might be better off going on Reddit and reading about our microdosing, the Reddit subreddit, and read about people who have tried this and see if any of them find it useful. So I'm not going to say, because I'm not recommending anything, and I'm not giving professional advice, that you should try it. But on the other hand, there seem to be people who are benefiting, and just because you've had psychosis at one point, the smart thing to do might be to start at a really super low dose. So if the normal dose of mushrooms is 0.05 to 0.3 grams of the standard golden teacher, something like that, maybe you should start at 0.03 grams if you're worried, or 0.01 grams. And if you don't feel anything at all, you don't think it made a difference, then go to 0.03 grams. So if you have concerns, we talk about placebo and nocebo. Nocebo is when you believe something bad is going to happen to you and you make it happen. That's part of what we're thinking could happen with the heart valve people, is that the focus on this is going to actually cause people enough stress and strain that they're going to bring about some of the very stuff that they don't want to have happen. So if you are worried because you have had psychosis in your past, I guess you should talk to your doctor, because that's what everyone says you should do. And if you're going to try it, look in the Reddit threads and see what people are saying, and then start at a super low dose. So low that it's almost inconceivable that you'll even notice anything. And if you're fine, go up a teeny tiny bit. And if I don't want to say, well, and if you do experience a psychotic fit, remember it's only part of who you are, because I don't think you're gonna. We haven't heard that. Sure, it could happen. Everybody's bio individual. I've known people who, they have one puff of pot, they go crazy. Like they're literally nuts for a day. There are people who are going to always have. So, we don't stop people driving because some are going to make accidents and hurt themselves and other people. We certainly don't stop people from using pharmaceuticals, which have terrible side effects and kill people. So again, the general reward to risk ratio is very high in microdosing. But if you're worried and if you think there might be any problem, start at a super low dose.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And while I think we could talk to you forever, we do need to wrap up and get you back to your day and get everyone in back to their evening. But we're going to give away one more. And I think probably the best question to ask, because we've said it a few times, is what is the name, whoever answers this first, what is the name of the book that Jordan co-wrote with Dr. James Fadiman? Whoever answers that first will get a second stack. Close, but no.
And while you're looking at that, let me do one thing. I'd like to invite everybody to go to the website. If you have stories, if you have questions, if you want to listen to the 10 or 15 other podcasts that Jim and I have done, including some famous and interesting and smart people. A new one came out today with Nick Gillespie, a famous libertarian, but he was great. Go to Microdosing Book, one word, microdosingbook.com. And, especially if you've got some great stories, because we're going to do what we always do, and we're going to feed back the citizen science, this real world evidence that isn't constrained by the RCT, into what we know and distill more of it and synthesize it and be able to give it back to people. The Microdosing Book.
And that's great. We're going to put in links of where people can find you on the playback. And the answer to that question, thank you so much, everyone that wrote the book we're talking about. It was the other book. I'm sorry, but Mackenzie got that right. The Symphony of Selves. Yes, you are right, Mackenzie.
Nice one, Mackenzie. So nice to see your name there as well. By the way, you guys, if you didn't have your question answered, you can always come through the DMs on our Instagram. We are super, super active. We also, both Shannon and I, offer 15-minute coaching sessions, completely free. And right now, it's a really interesting time for us because every quarter, about every 3 or 4 months, we run a sale. The entire website is on sale right now, 25% off. I believe it goes until
31st.
The 31st. Thank you, Shannon. So an amazing time to stock up. And if it's your first time ordering and you just don't kind of know how to navigate or have some questions around microdosing, just hit us up in the DM where we'd be happy to answer anything that comes through. Jordan, you finished the call. What message would you like to leave us with? And how do people get the book?
Sure, you can get the book anywhere where fine books, audio programs, and ebooks are sold. So it's everywhere. If you go on the website, microdosingbook.com, there's a locator that will tell you where to buy the book in your country and give you options that aren't only Amazon. So that's probably the best way. People really seem to be liking the audiobook. It's selling best because we've got a great world famous narrator who did a great job. I think what's most important to know is that we may be just at the beginning, really the beginning of knowing what microdosing is capable. When Jim started this 15 years ago, we knew almost nothing. He started putting out a signal, like in Dune, they put the thumper in the sand and it draws a sandworm because it's a steady, coherent signal, right? So Jim's got the signal going and people give him stories and he starts giving talks and reporters hear about it. And they hear that people are microdosing in Silicon Valley while they're doing coding. And so it's become more and more coherent all the way up to Ayla Waldman's book and Michael Pollan featuring him on Netflix. And so the book, the way it is now, is literally the strongest signal for microdosing that's ever existed. It is the most comprehensive book that's ever been on this subject. Yeah. And it does have the most kind of practical advice all summed up in one place, and it does have the most stories. So it's unclear if microdosing is here or if it's going to go like this. We just don't really know where we are in the curve. But even though we have a few bumps on the road right now, a study that's wrong because it didn't measure microdosing, Publishers Weekly saying our book is a piece of trash, because they don't believe in it. I mean, there are large forces opposing the idea that microdosing could be So, for example, amazingly successful for treatment-resistant depression. Even some
Yes.
of the biggest leaders and most famous folks are repeating, well, we're not sure if it's a microdose or not, and we think for serious conditions it has to be at high doses with a therapist. And we're going, that's not what the real world evidence says. So
Mhm.
we may only be at the beginning of this. In 5 or 10 years, you might find 2 or 5 or 10 times as many people microdosing worldwide, or maybe even more of that. And maybe that's just a dream, just like I think there should be 10 times as many people rebounding that there
I
are.
think you're right.
But I think microdosing is really just starting. And yeah, there's some issues around legality and doses and bad news reports that are coming out and misunderstanding. But that's why we're here, right? We're here to kind of like hold the torch of information and truth and a better way of healing that's tuned with natural plant medicines and their analogs that have such a high reward to risk ratio. So
Jordan,
this
you're
is
lighting
the
the way
beginning.
for ancient wisdom reborn.
Man,
Thank you
yeah,
so
no
much.
doubt.
Oh yeah,
Thank
thank you
you so
guys for
much for
having me.
being on the call.
So
Yeah, it's been
grateful. When
amazing.
you're
It
in
was
Canada
great to
next,
meet you
please let
both.
us know.
Per time. And if you want to do another one about human multiplicity and your symphony of selves, that's a whole long story involving
We definitely want to do another one.
why Sigmund Freud made a U-turn in the wrong direction, and lots of things happened. So that's a whole
I
different
want
kind
you
of
on my
book.
podcast. I will definitely reach out to you
Well,
again
let's
and
do
invite
another
you to
one,
be
and
on.
let's get a couple trampolines delivered while we do it too, and jump around and listen
Yeah,
to some tunes while we're doing it. Listen,
yeah.
man.
Listen to music.
And,
Listen to music.
and thank
This
you
was
everyone in our
fabulous.
community for popping on here.
Thank you guys. I hope everybody has a tremendous evening. Jordan, this was fabulous. So grateful for you guys. So grateful
Thank you.
to the contribution to this industry and this community. Yeah, man. And we want to send you some product as well. So we're going to be in touch with you.
Oh, great. I'm looking forward to this coming out and to promoting it on my socials. And, in some ways, I
Awesome.
spoke
Thank you.
more directly and freely and coherently here with you guys than I have before. I know I said
Thank
some things
you.
that I haven't said before, and I'm looking forward to listening to it again and, writing some of that down, getting a transcript.
Amazing. I'm going to message you right after this. Thank you, guys. Thank everybody for being on this call. Hope you have a great night.
You take care,
Microdose.
guys.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
See you soon.